afternoon for our third installment of KOGA's summer webinar series brought to you by CountryMark and Ergon. We appreciate the continued support of those sponsors, as well as our other sponsors who have sponsored us and continue to support us through the years. In particular, we have our sponsors for 2020 and those who have sponsored this webinar. They include AquaClear, Bingham Greenball and Dahl, Bitco, Black Ridge Resource Partners, Britannia, CountryMark, Cumberland Valley Resources, Diversified Gas and Oil, InLink Midstream, Ergon, Hughes Land, Phil Brown Insurance, Reliance Well Services, Steptoe and Johnson, and Wyatt Tarrant Combs. And we want to thank you again for your support of our webinar series. One thing that we haven't been able to accomplish here, but we have had a couple of virtual vendors. They are listed on KOGA's website at kyoilgas.org. They are Phil Brown Insurance and CountryMark, so be sure to check them out at our website under our Summer Series page. Next week, we will feature Liz Adams with the Kentucky Geological Survey. They are going to discuss core photography projects and other collectives and documents that are being photographed and documented within the Kentucky Geological Survey. So hopefully you'll be able to tune into that, and that's going to be at the same time next week at 2 p.m. Just a housekeeping item here. If Dennis will be on, he'll be giving his presentation. Probably be about 30 to 40 minutes, maybe shorter than that. But after his presentation, and during the presentation, if you have some questions, just make sure you do so in the Q&A or the chat feature area. And we'll make sure we'll collect those questions and ask him those at the end of his presentation. Stacy, I want to thank you and Michael for hosting the webinar as well and doing a great job with that. So appreciate that. So without further ado, just want to introduce Dennis. His full biography will be in the chat section, so make sure you take a look at that. But he is an engineer who's been with the division for about 3 years now, and I want to thank him for giving us the update today. And Dennis, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you once again for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that, and I assume I'll be getting a shared view screen, or if someone else is going to advance presentation. Either way will work.
I'll advance it. Thank you.
All right, very good. Thank you. All right, the first order of business, I want to thank everyone for inviting me to address this group. It is an honor and a privilege, and I appreciate that opportunity. There have been significant changes in the oil and gas regulations and statutes during 2019. And we actually were working on some outreach meetings. Ryan and I were communicating. We had hoped to have those in early April, and everybody will remember what happened. But when COVID-19 landed, it changed everything. So we had to cancel all of our reservations and just look for other opportunities. So I appreciate the opportunity to address this group and try to review some of the highlights of changes we've seen in the past year. The time that we have will obviously not allow me to do a detailed review, but I'll hit the key points as I best can, and please feel free to ask questions, and there are a lot of details that'll probably have to wait till we can talk further. But the next slide, if you would. Oh, I do have control. This is good. All right, thank you. Okay, the House Bill 199 was the key change that occurred in 2019, an act relating to oil and gas, and this legislation was generated through the efforts of the Oil and Gas Work Group. As everyone is familiar, the group's been working since 2014 to modernize oil and gas statutes. This particular piece of legislation was passed by the legislature in February and then signed by the governor in March, and it became effective on June 27 of 2019. This is at least the fourth key piece of legislation that come out of the work group and we've made a lot of progress and made some positive changes, we believe, through all the work that the work group has performed. To get into the details of House Bill 199, the key changes were new well bonding requirements, ownership and control was identified. See if I've got this. Permit transfer process was modified, and the CASTO program has become a new acronym for us. It was created, and I hope I'm getting received. Sometimes this thing beeps, and I'm not sure what's going on there. At the same time, there were some compliance enforcement measures addressed, and I won't really have time to get into those. Clarified use of the red tag and some court procedure issues and counties of filings. But a biggie that affected about all operators are some new forms were introduced to update the forms that the division had. And what everyone will note is that our forms have always been known with the initials ED, which we learned actually stood for Energy Department, and that went back plus 20 years, I guess. But it's been replaced by OG. So an ED1 is now an OG1, and an ED10 is now an OG10, for example. So we've updated and improved several of the forms and addressed some newer technologies and some of the new regulatory requirements. The bonding changes that became effective on June 27, 2019 could best be summarized as follows, as you can see on the screen. Individual well bonds for wells permitted or transferred prior to that date, June 27, they were unaffected. So any bonds in place or transferred before June 27, unaffected as far as individual well bonds. Blanket bonds issued prior remained valid and unaffected also. Wells could still be added by the operator to the prior law adherence allowance, and I've got a slide that'll show that. However, any operators that had wells in the top tier of the old system, over 500 wells, were capped at 1,000 wells. So any wells added above that current well count, if over 1,000, would require additional bonding under new tiers. For example, if an operator had a 50-well max bond with only 40 wells at that time, he could still add 10 wells to that old blanket bond. Second example, if an operator with 1,100 wells desired to add 10 wells, he would require additional bonding under the new tiers. So all pre-law, pre-change blanket bonds remained unaffected and fully valid to the maximum tier that they had at that time. The only exception being the very highest tier, which became capped at 1,000 wells. And here's a screen that will hopefully remind everyone. Blanket bond tier schedule under the old system before June 27, 2019. The tiers 1 to 25, 26 to 100, 101 to 500 were unchanged. The 500 plus wells became capped at 1,000, as I'll show you on the next slide. Individual wells at that time, individual wells under the old bond were $1 a foot, approximately. Give or take, it was in 500-foot increments. But the new bond structure is as shown here. And in that structure, the blanket bonds were effectively doubled. 1 to 25 became 20,000. Individual bonds, as you can see at the bottom, were basically calculated at $2 per foot with no rounding. So a 900-foot well becomes an $1,800 bond. Mathematically, it wasn't rounded up. The blanket bonds 1 to 25 became 20,000, 26 to 100 became 50, 101 to 500 became 200,000, and 501 to 1,000 became 300,000. And over 1,000, it would add per the tiers above. In other words, you would start again at the lowest tier desired and move on up the chain. But that's the structure of the new bonds that became effective on June 27 of 2019. The old blanket is still in effect and will carry forward for all the wells, the operators that had those in place before the law changed. Ownership and control was defined under the new law. House Bill 199, there was a lot of discussion about this. It closed some loopholes in KRS that had previously allowed the individuals to forfeit a bond. And as we know, in some cases, they could re-enter the industry using another entity name, and they could avoid the statutory permit block provisions under 590. So this change, the definition strengthened the prior provisions of 353-590, which does require that operators with unabated violations or bond forfeitures to be permit blocked until an agreement resolving those issues is established with the department. Let me stop and add something here. We have done a lot of what we call the grace and forgiveness provisions, grace and forgiveness agreements. That's coming from a Sunday school teacher. But we recognize that, you know, things happen, and so we can usually work with operators to resolve those incidents that may be back there and set a path toward compliance. So we've done several of those agreements in the past 2 years, and we continue to work with operators to accomplish those. There are probably about 4 underway right now. But overall, we think the ownership and control change does benefit the industry. It reduces the ability of bad actors to operate without accountability. It levels the playing field. Otherwise, you know, the operators that are doing all of their requirements are held to a different standard than operators that don't. So we do think that it overall is a benefit to the industry. A control person is now defined by the statutes and the regulations. It's defined to mean a person who has the ability to commit financial resources to a well operation, or has the ability to determine how a well is operated, plugged, and abandoned. If a person has a relationship that gives that person authority to determine how a well is operated, they become a control person. That includes a rebuttable presumption of control if a wife or child files an application. It further is defined as anyone who's an officer, director, or general partner of an entity that has the forfeiture or violation, or has ownership equal to or exceeding 50%. And what this also does is it gives criteria for when a person is not a control person. Permit transfer process, I can safely say that it's had problems. It's been problematic in the past, and we've had some different discussions. There's always been a backlog. Well, I'm having trouble, folks. Give me a minute here. All right, control persons now defined. To skip the CASTO program. The CASTO program was established in House Bill 199. If you'll recall, there was a 2015 abandoned tanks program that was created, but it did not have funding established. So what CASTO became is a program that included orphan wells to address concerns of unfunded liability exceeding the current fund's capacity. It provides a mechanism for funding that we didn't have before. To remind those that were familiar with the 2015 Oil and Gas Modernization Act, it defined the scope of abandoned tanks and the need to reclaim them, and even made provisions for the scope of work. But what it did not address is funding. So we had a program that did not have a mechanism for funding. What House Bill 199 created was a mechanism for funding through the biennial budget process. CASTO was expanded to add reclamation of abandoned storage tanks, plugging of orphan wells, and also emergency response to imminent threats posed by oil and gas facilities. Now, the last one was kind of a last thought on the part of cabinet management. I think they had concerns with an active facility that for some reason could not see a response in a timely fashion, but I don't really see that clause being enacted, you know, in most situations. This is primarily about abandoned tanks and orphan wells. but they did add a provision that there could be response if there were an imminent threat of danger or environmental impact. But this CASTO program, as we'll talk further in the discussion, it began a process to address pre-law oil and gas legacy issues that we're concerned to a lot. I know landowners, tourism folks, farmers, a lot of people are concerned about oil and gas wells and oil and gas tanks across the Commonwealth that really don't have a path to remediation. So CASTO, we believe, is the future of a great program that will help us catch up with some issues that happened long before there was a law, before there was any provisions to address it. A lot of these problems are pre-law, and we're trying to find a mechanism that helps us address those issues. The other change that occurred is the permit transfer process. It has been problematic. We've had considerable backlogs. I can confess that. I'm the director. I can say that. We've had a lot of problems with the well transfer process. It hasn't been smooth or efficient for any of us. So I believe that these changes are positive. The operator is to submit a well transfer request with bond and fee. The transfer fees were increased from $25 to $50 per well. The division will print out a well records report for each of those wells and provide to both the current operator and the proposed successor operator. And if any active violations or missing records are reflected in that report, the successor may decline to accept transfer of specific wells or may agree to accept responsibility for those deficiencies. So the successor is basically to respond in writing within 30 days of the report date. And based upon his response, the division shall approve the transfer of any wells not declined by the successor. The division may not hold the successor responsible for missing records not disclosed or for those which information is not reasonably available. And I've shortened that, but I think it's understood. Basically, the division needs to give people notice of here are the issues with these wells, and then the successor operator has a decision to make. And as it points out there, based on his response, the division can approve the transfer of those wells if all the other mechanisms and bonding and fees are covered and in place. A new area that we needed to address came about in regard to the operations and reclamation plans. This was really driven by changes within the Division of Water. In the process of them repealing 401 KAR 5090, there was a need to cover some areas that would not be covered. And two of those areas were pits and signage. And therefore, the operation and reclamation plans needed to be modified, and KAR 1170, which is our regulation that addresses reclamation plans, needed to be expanded to include construction requirements for pits, and we're speaking to drilling pits. These are all temporary structures. And the key points would include that the pits would be constructed on cut or high wall side of well sites in a non-fill area. This has always been the standard and always in the BMPs. We actually, through discussions, were able to provide a mechanism for waiver if there were a situation where that was not attainable, and the waiver really wasn't there before. But if the field inspector concludes that an alternate approach will be stable and you can prevent the pit failure, then there are allowances that an operator, and that might happen more likely in East Kentucky, would have to, for whatever reason, limited topography, property lines, whatever issues, could be forced to have to work out of a solid cut side of the high wall. So as long as he can establish to the inspector that it will be stable and that we won't have a pit failure, then that requirement can be waived. Pits will be lined with an impermeable synthetic material with minimum thickness of 10 mils. This has actually been in the reclamation plan BMPs, best management practices, since 2015 at least. The change here is that the thickness is now 10 mils, reduced from 20, and there's actually a provision added again from discussion with all the stakeholders at the table that the pit liner can be waived by the field inspector in certain situations, and those situations are defined if mud drilling techniques are used and the inspector confirms the presence of clay soil. And Bill Barr and others can speak to, how these discussions go. All the stakeholders are at the table, and we were able to make the case that this is a perfectly safe process that accomplishes the intent of lining it, because if you have enough clay material, you don't need a synthetic liner. So for that reason, we were able to make the case that certainly mud drilling should be the exception, and we were able to get that approved by the group. So pit liners can be waived by the inspector in mud drilling situations. Diversion ditches should be constructed upslope, and that's just to limit the inflow into the pit, again, so that you have maximum capacity. The pit should be constructed to maintain a continuous freeboard of 2 feet above ground level, just recognizing the need not to overflow the pit so that it doesn't trigger any kind of erosion or slope failure issue. But these are basically to be incorporated into the reclamation plan regs in KAR 1170 in Section 5. And that further continues to address requirements for the active operation and the closure of pits. And that includes that pits shall not remain open for more than 30 days after drilling or well completion, unless an extension is requested and approved by the Division of Oil and Gas. I will expand that to remind everybody that multi-well pads, it's when the last well is completed. So, it's at the end of that project effectively. And the 30 days can be extended upon written request. The director may extend the life of the pit for a maximum of 90 days after drilling or well completion. When the pit is closed, when the drilling pit is closed, all standing fluids in the pit are to be removed. The operator will ensure solidification of drill cuttings by mixing soil, and all these are standard practices. Pit solids shall be encapsulated in the liner and buried prior to reclamation. The pit shall be backfilled with earthen material and then graded to establish a natural grade for drainage. So these are pretty much just removed from one section of law and placed in another, and they came under the 170 reclamation plan provisions now, where they were before really under 5090 in the Division of Water. There was a provision for new tank signage requirements. We had danger sign language before in this area of 160. This was expanded beyond danger signs to add the tank battery ID signs that were required under 5090 previously. And it's simply for identification purposes in the case of an emergency. The operator shall display a printed identification sign on tank battery facilities, and it shall include tank battery operator, lease name, GPS location, emergency 24-hour phone number for the operator, and then the DEP hotline response. All of these really go to notification in case of emergency, and while we normally think that means a tank spill, it could be anything from a leak that the operator doesn't know about. It could be a forest fire. Somebody's got to get a hold of the tank operator and let him know there's a problem. So there are a lot of good reasons to people to be able to identify who the operator is and to contact them. The regulation says the signs shall be less than 17 inches by 28 inches, and letters shall not be less than 2 inches in height. And if the ownership is transferred, the new operator shall revise the sign to reflect the new ownership within 60 days. I think we have a template of just a what if it would look like. This is a Marvin Combs special. He created this template. And as most of us know, we try to be practical people. We're not going to be out there with the measuring tape, calling your hand if it's 26 inches. What we're interested in, that it has the key content that's needed, that it has the identifiable information, that allows people to identify who the operator is and to contact them in case of emergency. And in some cases, in many cases, it will be for the benefit of the operator if something happens. And we've been on many of those where, you know, crazy things happen out in the woods and somebody shoots a hole in a tank and you don't know about it. It kind of helps. Somebody will call you and tell you. So there's benefit to having the ability to get a hold of people and be sure that emergency contacts are in place. So this is the tank template. This thing reminds me of some steering wheels that I've experienced in rental cars. Some of them turn fast and some turn slow. Our our Kentucky Division of Oil and Gas forms changes. They're all on the website. Our new forms actually became effective February 3rd, just based upon the closing of the legislature. But our communications have obviously been delayed by the COVID-19 crisis. But there are some significant changes. We do need people to get on board and use these forms. The new permit application form, the OG1, is now a 3-page form as it incorporates some additional information. The well log and completion report, the OG3, requires additional information as well based on newer technologies. The application for a gathering line permit, the OG11, includes a required tank site GPS location for future mapping. The reason that is there is we're in the process of trying to map storage tank batteries across the Commonwealth. We've obviously started in the CASTO program with abandoned, but at the same time, the benefit is there to know where all the tank batteries are. So this is part of that process that as new tanks are installed, typically a gathering line permit is not obtained until the operator has a productive well. When they send in that application for permit, it now includes a required tank site GPS location so that it can be mapped into a database. The well transfer application, OG13, has some new language about defining all the parties, I believe, and also has the new fee established on it. The annual production report form, this is a new area. The OG17 has a tank site report sheet. At the very back of your annual reports, there'll be an attachment that people can list their tanks and GPS locations. The first couple of years will go pretty tough because there's going to be a lot of catch up, and I can't begin to tell you when we'll actually get all of this in working mode, but we've got to start somewhere. So this is the beginning. It would be submitted with the OG17 production report, and we will attempt to get that information mapped into a system that, similar to our gathering line map, that we're able to identify where all of the active and abandoned tank sites are across the Commonwealth. It's a goal, and this just begins the journey. It's part of the process. The MIT certification form, which is now the OG22, no longer has a notary line. That's been pretty important, and I can't remember how many people have told me that thing is a real pain, and I know Rudy was one of them, but we were able to get that cleaned up. All of the KDOG forms have been revised and updated. We would encourage operators to begin utilizing these as soon as possible. We have not set a drop dead date yet, but we need to get everybody on board with these forms as soon as we can. We recognize the complexity of our current situation with the ongoing crisis, and we're trying to work with people to accomplish the goal. And then just as general updates within the Division of Oil and Gas. Permitting, and I'm hoping everybody can see these. My screen is a little limited, so I'm just hoping you're able to see them. But the 3-year permit history is kind of interesting. In 2018, we had 179 permits issued. 2019, we were down to 157. 2020, we have year-to-date 62. What's interesting is that a year ago today, in 2019, we were at 70. So that shocked me a little bit, to be honest with you. I expected us to be much further behind. with the market economics, tough times out there, but we're year-to-date 62 compared to last year 70. It's a little bit surprising in the first 6 months. The blue line is the 2018 permitting activity. The orange line is 2019, and then the gray line reflects year-to-date permits issued right by the Division of Oil and Gas. And it's interesting to notice where they're at. This is information nobody else has seen, but you'll find it interesting. This changes every year. The last couple of years, Lawrence County has been the big player with the highest number of well permits. But this year, Adair County has 10. Warren County has 9. And then, on behind there, Wolfe County. And those aren't normally the top players in the active oil production activity. This was kind of a change. There have been a few moving factors, but the number one counties so far in 2020, Adair at 10, Warren at 9, and then Wolfe County at 8. And I know for at least the last 2 years it's been Lawrence and probably 3. Lawrence had generally led the sheets, as I recall. Just an update on the underground injection program. We've still got a lot of activity. Project to date, since March of 2017, we have approved 16 Kentucky UIC permits to date. That's including 2 that were issued in 2020. There are currently about 9 permit applications pending, and Kim Collins has been putting a lot of work in trying to catch those up. We have made progress, and I know we're outperforming where the EPA was. For anybody that's not happy with our progress, all I can reference you to is the EPA's track record. I think we do a lot better than they did. So we've issued 2 so far in 2020. We are still working to transition financial responsibility, what we call bonding in the Class 2 program, of current operators from EPA to Kentucky Control. And we have had problems matching EPA Class 2 well census to current operators. It's cost us a lot of work, and we're still digging through it. Their records did not match our records, and we inherited some difficult file records to sort through in getting through what the EPA identified as operators and what's actually happening in the field. So we continue to work on that, and we've also got several UIC operators that have not been responsive. And what you're going to see, in many of these cases, they're out of business. I understand what's happened out there. So many of these unresponsive, probably the wells are idle, maybe abandoned. But as we get opportunity, we're checking those off. We're trying to go out in the field and inspect the well and identify if they are currently being operated. The division has completed 111 mechanical integrity tests during 2019, and since the program began, 377. We typically see anywhere from 100 to 180 MIT tests per year is what the record seems to be to this point. And then our metrics for the program, you can see the permits issued 2017, 18, and 19. Permit mods where there have been applications for pressure increases, and water monitoring reports, UIC field inspections, and mechanical integrity test. Gives you some sense of how things have gone. As far as the Castro program update, we have completed reclamation of 59 individual tank sites in East, West, and South Central Kentucky. Out of those, 210 abandoned tanks were removed and remediated. We did find some surprises, and I don't have time to get into the details. It would be great to talk about, but we found some buried pockets of crude oil. We found some flow lines that were still leaking after the tank was cleaned up. So we've been learning along the process, but we did some good work, and the befores and afters are going to be impressive when you see them. We did encounter some hesitancy with private landfills, discussion to have about accepting material without prior sampling and analysis. I know we have an EPA waiver that says it's not hazardous material and it should have just gone straight, but we actually had to do sampling and analysis on most of our material. T-norm was an issue, and my little note says, but it should not have been. And again, room for more discussion about this, but this very short summary of that is even when you find micro R readings that are just over 5, 5.5, 6, 5 is background, 5 is nothing. Anything over 5, we couldn't find a landfill in Kentucky that would take it. So we ended up having to ship some out of state. There wasn't a lot of it, but there was some. But it's just part of a discussion for the work group to have sometime. I don't know what operators are encountering out there, if they have this same problem, but we learned, as a state agency, just how difficult it was to handle some of this material. So it's been educational for us, and maybe we can all take our shared information and figure out some solutions.
Hey, Dennis?
Yes.
This is Ryan. I hate to interrupt. I just want to say to our participants that are listening, if you do have questions, we are nearing the end of the presentation, so make sure you type those in the Q&A or the chat feature, and we'll get those addressed. So, Dennis, I'll turn it back over to you.
Very good. Most of you are familiar with our current budget crisis in the state, and because of that, CASTO is currently not funded for fiscal 21. I know they're going to have to wait and see what all the revenue impacts are. I think there's a lot of worry even about, funding all of the state employees, the current status that we have. So we'll see how CASTO goes forward. It is a good program. It's a great program. It does good work. We learned, and I think given time, we can get better as it goes along. State well plugging program. There's always work to be done, and most of these problems, I will readily say, are many of them are pre-law, and we just have to deal with them when they pop up. But I am glad to say, when you identify all the trouble areas, there are a lot. That's the typical map of where our abandoned and orphan wells are, and that's a moving target. But within that, here's what we've done in the last 2 years, and I'll give you a moment to absorb that. We had some big years earlier in the early 2000s, and then we hit some hard times around 2013. And most of you remember, we had a major hit from an out-of-control well that had to be plugged in McGoffin County, and it cost us almost $400,000. So it kind of put a pretty big dent in the fund, and it's taken us a while to recover. And we've also encountered problems with finding contractors. You've probably seen some articles recently. The state of Ohio had all kinds of money, and they couldn't find contractors to plug their wells. I think they had a $25 million fund to go plug wells and couldn't spend it all. So it's kind of interesting what everybody's problems are, but contractors have been an issue from time to time. We've made some progress. 2019, we pushed harder and I guess beat the bushes a little more to try to get more wells into the program and get them plugged. In 2019, we actually got it up to 66 wells plugged. The prior year was 9, and then you can kind of see all those little bars behind that. 66 was a big year. Year to date in 2020, we have plugged 146 wells, and we haven't plugged that many since 2006. We're halfway through the year, and we continue to push this thing hard. We're making good progress, doing some good work. There's an opportunity here because, I realize the industry's hurting, contractors are hurting, and they need work. We have been able to use that as an opportunity to aggressively push for state well plugging. And I'm proud of what we've got accomplished so far this year. That's good news. And I wanted to share it with you, and we hope to keep that up because the more we do of this, it's a better reflection upon the industry. We're addressing problems. We're fixing wells that are, in backyards and farm bottoms, and and in some cases in creek beds. We're doing some good work, and I'm pleased with what's getting done. But a lot of wells plugged so far this year in 2020. And then there's always more work to be done, and I just throw that in. Everybody knows that, but it's just part of my task, I guess. Those wells haven't been plugged yet. Far left is Lawrence County, far right is McGoffin County, and it's an H2S well, and somebody stuck a flare on it because it was smelling so bad. So that's somebody borrowed a flare from somewhere to keep it from just having gas floating around their neighborhood. And the middle one, I believe, is Webster County. And a little bit good news to wrap up. We turned 60 as a division last week on June 16th. This division of oil and gas was established by act of the legislature on June 16 of 1960. So happy birthday to us. We've a lot of good people have done a lot of good work, and they've made a lot of progress, and we've always got more to do. But we are pleased with the work of the Division of Oil and Gas. We've made some good progress. And that was the last slide, and we're ready for questions. Ryan, however you want to conduct this.
Sure. I just got a few here, and I guess fire those to you at will. One question, and I'll go into the next one, but how has the coronavirus changed your method of operations as far as inspections, working from home, that type of thing? Just curious how you guys operate given the conditions that we're under.
It has absolutely impacted us. Fortunately, taking first the Frankfort staff as an example, we are all under governor's order to do maximum telecommuting. I'm obviously here in my office today, but I have been basically working from my home in Louisa, Kentucky. I come in one day a week to basically sign documents, pick up mail, and one of the other employees comes in one day a week to do that. We distribute mail out to our employees that are telecommuting. The work's still happening, and we've been fortunate that our computer technology has moved along well. We're able to get good work done. We are doing bond releases. We are processing permits. I lost count of how many permits have been approved during the COVID crisis, but I'm going to say 20 during this. The work has continued because that all began. We basically were sent home right near the end of March, early April, maybe it was April 1st. So all the Frankfort staff's working from home. We forward phones, and we respond to our emails, and with the help of the IT group, we have managed to be connected. We can pull up our databases, and then in my little office at Louisa, I can pull up operators and violations and history, and and print and respond to any issues that come up. And I still get them. My desk phone is transferred to my office phone, so I still answer. In the field, we fortunately haven't been too impacted because our oil and gas inspectors all work from home. That's our structure. They are assigned home offices. Where it's impacted them is meetings. Under the governor's order, we don't do private meetings. We try to do as much as we can by email, text, or telephone. There are obviously situations that we can't do that, and so we handle those with social distancing. When you're plugging state bid wells, as we are, all you can do is be as careful as you can, wear a mask when appropriate, and keep your 6 foot apart. Despite all that, we're getting a lot of wells plugged. So in the field, impacted some, primarily in the area of plugging and citizens' complaints. We just try to handle them as much as we can electronically or telephonically. In the office, we are issuing permits, bond releases, and processing records. So it's working. I won't say it's the maximum efficiency that we had before. Any of you will find out that mail moves a little slower. We pick it up at least one day a week. It takes us a little longer to get it distributed, but the work's happening, and I feel like we're making good progress, Ryan.
Thank you for that. And we got a few more questions here, pretty popular today. So how many different contractors does the division currently use? Are they vetted, and do you have any vendor events that's sponsored by the state of Kentucky?
We don't have any events. Obviously, we're not allowed to have meetings. So
Right.
but we have a lot of interest, remarkably, and we struggled at times. There were times, especially in East Kentucky, we couldn't hardly get 2 contractors to bid sometimes. Part of this relates to COVID and what you guys have seen in the industry and how it's impacted you. But we have between 6 and 10 contractors across the state that are knocking at our doors to plug state bid wells. We are seeing bidding activity like never before. It's much more competitive, and we're getting some good work done. People are hungry to get the work done, and I've seen a higher level of competitive interest in state bid wells than we had ever had. So we got good interest, and I know I'll mess up the count, but it's at least 6 to 10. I know I've seen individual well bids of at least 6 bidders. And that's, and those are regional. Service contractors are regional. Some of them will cover the entire eastern side of the state. Some of them are pretty much exclusively West Kentucky. But we have good interest and good contractor engagement. So that's actually a good news response.
Okay, and I think our last question here, and there may be some more that come in behind this one, but as the division integrates the UIC well data, will those well records eventually end up in the state archive by the Kentucky Geological Survey? In other words, are they considered public record like other well records?
Yes, state bid well, plug-in affidavits are submitted in the same process. Yes, so the only difference is the operators effectively the Division of Oil and Gas, because it's an orphan well. So we still compete plugging affidavits, and we submit those to KGS just like all the others.
Okay, and kind of a hypothetical moving forward. How do you see the division operating post-COVID?
I think our world has changed. I can't speak for exactly the structure that the state will assume after this, but I think we can all see that telecommuting actually works. And I'll be one of the first to say I was a naysayer. I was pretty sure it wouldn't, but I've learned a lot myself. We have made it work. Some divisions can do it more than others. There are some divisions that, you got to have mapping and plotters, and it doesn't work well. There are some jobs that are labs that are file archive scanning, those really can't telecommute. But I think what we'll all see is more telecommuting. It's become a more convenient option just because the technology has come along so far. And most of us are doing Zoom meetings or Teams meetings or Chime meetings or WebEx meetings. We're all into terminology and technology that we hadn't used before. So I think it has changed going forward. There will be fewer large group meetings. I don't think they'll go away because I think they're a good thing. But I do believe that the office structure in the regulatory arena will change. There'll be people that can telecommute, and I think they've proven that it does work. Inspections won't change. We continue to be there, but I think it will impact the administrative and technical side surprisingly a good bit.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Our last question. Really appreciate your time and answers. I think that we'll get up your contact information, and if anybody has any questions, they'll know how to reach you. And for that, we hope you stay safe and healthy. Is there any last parting words before we leave the chat video?
I just say that I appreciate again the opportunity, and I couldn't really do justice to everything here. It would have taken too long. I tried to hit the highlights, and I know folks, Rudy and Bill and others that have been in the meetings are going to remember a lot of details that should be added to this. So hopefully over time we can expand the discussion, but it lets us at least get some news out.
All right. Well, thank you once again. And we'll get your contact information up, and thank you so much for joining us, and be safe, be healthy, and we'll see you when this all ends.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And to the participants out there, we're again, check out our next webinar next Tuesday at 2 p.m. with Liz Adams of the Kentucky Geological Survey. We'll be talking about core photography, core sample photography. So we once again appreciate our sponsors and look forward to our discussion next week. Thank you.